Now let's turn our focus to Afghanistan, where the Taliban look like they're actually up to something good. Last year, they banned the cultivation of poppy. That's the crop used to make the drug heroin. It was a major source of income for Afghan farmers, also a major source of funding for the Taliban. But they banned it. Now, on the face of it, the move seems like a rare positive by the Taliban, but the West is not happy with it. They're now raising an alarm over the shortage of the drug. Not making this up. Some in the West do not want this poppy ban to continue because this could lead to problems on Western shores. Our next report explains.
The Taliban are in the middle of a war. Not the usual kind though. It's their version of a war on drugs. You see, Afghanistan is the world's heroin basket. For years it has produced over 80% of the world's heroin. But last year, the Taliban put a ban on poppy cultivation. Poppy is the crop that is eventually turned into opium and then heroin. It was grown throughout Afghanistan, especially in the west and southwest. Nowadays, you see headlines about the Taliban burning down fields of the crop. Now you'd think this was a good thing. The women-hating tribal warlords finally doing something good for a change. But it seems that the West isn't too happy about this move. Take a look at these headlines. The first article talks about how the Taliban's successful opium ban is bad for Afghans and the world. Yes, really. It's by the United States Institute of Peace. The organization is an independent institute founded by the US Congress, and it warns about the dangers of less opium in the world. Let's first look at some of the points raised. It says that poppy farming has helped Afghan farmers survive the chaos the country regularly goes through, that forcing them to move to other crops would bring more hardship to the small-scale farmers. It would also widen existing inequalities. Rich farmers could hoard opium harvests and sell the crop at a higher rate when supplies dry up. The poor farmers will be at risk. They could resort to selling assets like livestock to make ends meet, leading to ruin in the long run. This sounds like a humane argument. It considers the plight of poor Afghan farmers. But let's look at the other side. Almost 3.5 million Afghans are addicted to opium in some form or the other. That's about 10% of the population. The drug is wrecking lives, more so since the Taliban took over in 2021. After all, a lot of people turned to drug abuse to cope with the horror of the Taliban's return. So while the plight of the farmers is important, opium may not be the best way to support their welfare. The other arguments raised against an opium ban in the USIP article and others don't really focus on Afghans. They're about what will happen to the West. An opium and heroin ban will reduce the supply of the drugs in Europe because most of Afghanistan's heroin makes its way to Europe via Iran, Turkey, and then the Balkans. The relative ease of heroin access actually shields Europe from worse narcotics. From synthetic opioids like fentanyl. That's a drug leaving a trail of bodies in the US. It's reportedly 50 times stronger than natural heroin. Europe has managed to stay relatively fentanyl-free for now. The end of Afghan opium could change that, bring about a worse drug crisis in Europe. Now you can still justify this fear. While not brave or ideal, countries are of course allowed to prioritize the lives of their citizens over foreigners. But the other reasons given are less about life and more about comfort, the fear of immigrants. Once again, Europe wants to keep refugees away. Afghan refugees this time. The articles against the opium ban warn of a new exodus from Afghanistan, of farmers who lose their livelihoods coming to seek asylum in Europe. And for that, the solution seems to be letting them continue farming poppy. It's ridiculous. How can the West be so xenophobic that they would prefer more drug production in the world over accepting refugees? How can they advocate just letting Afghans make more heroin instead of making room for refugees looking for a better life? The ending of Afghan opium should be celebrated. Any short-term difficulties the people face should be addressed through aid. For once, the Taliban seem to be on the right track. This should be encouraged. Because look at the alternative. The Taliban have historically depended on heroin for funding. And if they cannot feed the Afghan people, if they face too much public anger, they might just restart poppy cultivation. Then xenophobic Westerners may sign relief, but Afghans and the rest of the world will continue to suffer from a drug crisis.
We should all be worried about the worsening human rights situation in India.
Those who are not Hindu and particularly Christians are facing growing intolerance.
We as a Christian community can respect other faiths and identities. We must ask our partners to do the same.
And it is our duty to make sure that they stop, also in Manipur.
The European Union is back in the news. Last week, they were lecturing India on human rights. They were debating the situation in Manipur. And look what they're doing now. Hiring a bouncer. You heard that right. The European Union has hired a bouncer, the kind you see at clubs or bars. Just one difference though. This bouncer is not a human being. It's an entire country. This one, Tunisia. It's a country in northern Africa. It's a jumping point for migrants traveling to Europe. This map should help you understand. If you take a boat from Tunisia to Italy, it's 600 kilometers. So migrants from Africa often gather in Tunisia, and from here, they cross over to Italy. But Europe wants to stop this migration. So what are they doing? On Sunday, 3 European leaders flew down to Tunisia. EU Chief Ursula von der Leyen, Italy's Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni, and the Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte. They held talks with the Tunisian president and signed a deal. Now, the EU is calling it a comprehensive strategic partnership, but let's call it what it is, a bouncer for hire. Tunisia has agreed to strengthen its borders, to basically stop migrants from leaving for Europe. And what do they get in return? Money, a lot of it. EU leaders have promised more than $1 billion in aid. The specifics are not out, but you get the idea of this transaction. Europe pays Tunisia to keep migrants out. They don't want to get their hands dirty. Mighty Europe cannot round up and deport helpless people. That would be a human rights violation. So instead, they're outsourcing the job. They're asking Tunisia to do it. On paper, Brussels has refuted this charge. The EU president says it's all about tackling smuggling.
We need to crack down on criminal networks of smugglers and traffickers. They are exploiting human despair, and we have to break their reckless business model. So we will work with Tunisia on an anti-smuggling operational partnership.
How noble of Europe. They're not keeping migrants out, they're just concerned for their safety. Let's not kid ourselves here. The problem is not smuggling or trafficking. The problem here is race. Europe had no issues welcoming refugees from Ukraine. Around 8 million of them are registered in the EU. 8 million in just 500 days. Compare this to the numbers from Africa. Italy has reported, in fact, 75,000 migrants in 6 months. I'm not saying welcome all of them. After all, these are migrants, these are not refugees, so Europe can choose to resettle them or not. I'm saying be consistent. Practice what you preach about human rights. Do not outsource your crackdowns to other countries, because that's exactly what Europe has done. Tunisia may be a democracy on paper, but their president has a problematic track record. He's jailed critics and journalists. He's increased the powers of his office, and he's also reduced the parliament to a rubber stamp. What has the EU said about all of this? Well, in 2021, they had a lot to say. The European Parliament accused Tunisia of cracking down on freedoms. But I guess that's all in the past. Under this deal, Tunisia will take back only their migrants, meaning Tunisians. What about the rest? People from all over Africa and even Asia gather here to migrate. Take a look at what Tunisia does to them.
In Tunisia, the police arrested us, beat us, and took our phones and all our money. They told us to go to Libya, and my people kept saying that Libya is very bad, but they left us without food and water. They put us there and then left.
As we tried to enter the Tunis again, they now beat us badly. They now broke this my hand, or my head. They now tear it. That's what happened.
So that's what Tunisia does to migrants, and pretty soon they will get paid for it. $1 billion check to keep migrants out of Europe. The UK is doing something similar. They signed a special deal with Rwanda. Under this deal, the UK would send asylum seekers to Central Africa. Rwanda would host them. In return, the British government agreed to pay the Rwandan government. It was so cruel, even British courts disagreed. They called it unlawful. Now imagine if some other country had done this, say in Asia or in Latin America. The criticism would have been unrelenting. The European Parliament would have debated it. But now there is silence, not a word of criticism against this racist policy. And that's what it is, racist. EU chief Ursula von der Leyen called it shared prosperity. What exactly are they sharing? Most of Africa was colonized by Europe. Their plunder and persecution is partly responsible for Africa's troubles today. If anything, Europe should be paying reparations. They should take in more people. Instead, they've hired a bouncer. Next time Europe lectures someone, remember this deal. Just point them towards Tunisia. Now let's talk about the Commonwealth, an irrelevant institution for the modern era. It was established with a goal to unite former British colonies. The British wanted a way to exert their influence on them. The answer was the Commonwealth. But this grouping is facing serious challenges. The latest one is this: a sudden announcement from Australia, from the Australian state of Victoria. In 2026, Victoria was supposed to host the Commonwealth Games. But now they've changed their mind. Victoria has called off the Games. Why? Because they are too costly. Victoria says the projected cost of the event has tripled and they simply cannot afford it. So they called it off.
Look, I've made a lot of difficult calls, a lot of very difficult decisions in this job. This is not one of them. Frankly, $6 to $7 billion for a 12-day sporting event, we are not doing that. That does not represent value for money. That is all cost and no benefit.
He makes a lot of sense. Let's look at the budget. When Victoria started the preparations, they set aside $1.8 billion for the event. This was the initial estimate, $1.8 billion. Victoria won the bid to host the Games last year, in 2022. But within a year, the budget had to be revised because the costs began to mount. And the final budget is projected to cross some $4 billion, which is more than twice the original estimate. Local officials say the event might end up costing even more. They're quoting figures as high as $6 billion. So Victoria had to make a choice: either divert funds from government schemes to go ahead with the Games, or just call it off, call off the entire event. They chose option 2. They cancelled the whole thing. So now there is no host for the 2026 Games, and this has triggered a big debate. Australian officials are divided. I have a quote from Craig Phillips. He is the chief of the Commonwealth Games in Australia. This is an association. They promote Commonwealth sports in the country. Phillips says the claims over cost are quote-unquote exaggerated. In fact, let me quote from what he said. The Victorian government willfully ignored recommendations to move events to purpose-built stadia in Melbourne, and in fact remained wedded to proceeding with expensive temporary venues in regional Victoria. So there is now an internal tussle. Where does this leave the organisers? In a fix. They don't have a venue for the 2026 Games. They have two options as of now: find a new host or convince Victoria to change its mind. They can try that by helping with the finances. Also, other Australian states can help by sharing some responsibilities. They can, but they don't seem interested. New South Wales has refused, again due to budgetary pressures. Queensland, Tasmania, South Australia and Western Australia have all ruled out participation. Only one Australian state seems interested, that's Perth. Its Lord Mayor has shown interest in replacing Victoria as the host. So we'll have to see how this plays out. But this is an interesting shift. Earlier, hosting these games was considered a matter of pride. It was a privilege. There used to be fierce bidding to win the rights to play host. But that's not the case anymore. Today, these hosting rights are considered a liability in a lot of cases because the bill is way too high. Take the case of the 2026 Games. There was only one bid for hosting rights, and that one bid came from Victoria and Australia. No other Commonwealth country applied. In the last few years, the event has struggled to maintain its relevance. Out of the last 5 editions, 4 were held either in Australia or Britain. That alone should tell you about the decline in interest. Our viewers in India would remember the 2010 Games. India was the host, and there was a lot of controversy, serious charges of corruption. And this has been the story elsewhere too. So many leaders feel it's better to stay away than play a host and get embroiled in the mess that follows. And this, by the way, is happening with the Olympic Games too. According to a study, hosting the Summer Games, the Summer Olympic Games, costs well above $5 billion, and the Winter Games at least $3.1 billion. These estimates are from a few years ago, so the cost would have only gone up. And then there are the overruns. Going by one estimate from MIT, the average Olympics goes over budget by 156%. 156%. Another concern is the maintenance of the infrastructure. What do you do with all these stadia and facilities after the Games? In many host cities, such venues lie neglected. Let me show you some pictures. This is the aquatic stadium from the 2016 Rio Olympics. It doesn't have any water. Now look at this. A stadium from the 2004 Athens Games. It is crumbling. Officials around the world see this. Leaders see it too, which is why interest in such sporting events is declining. To remain relevant, they will have to reinvent themselves and rein in the costs. Our next story is about a particular kind of pain. It is known to nearly every person who has ever held a job. The tyranny of tedious meetings. Many call pointless meetings mind-numbing. Some say they're soul-sucking, even torturous. While the same old jokes are criminally repeated, intense boredom reigns supreme, minutes are made and several hours are lost. But that's not all. Remember the age-old maxim, time is money? Well, a study says that's true for meetings as well. Unnecessary meetings do not just waste time, they also waste money, and they cost big companies $100 million every year. Firms are slowly waking up to this fact. The latest among them is a Canadian company, an e-commerce platform called Shopify. It has started putting a price tag on meetings. The company uses a special calculator which is embedded in each employee's calendar app. It uses an average salary of the employee's role, the duration of a meeting and its attendee count. Then it estimates the cost of these meetings. A typical half-hour meeting costs anywhere between $700 and $1,600. But put a senior executive to the mix and the cost shoots above $2,000. Can you imagine your company treating you to a $700 dinner? The chances are slim, but that's how much they casually spend on a useless meeting. Now, I'm not saying all meetings are bad. Sometimes they are essential, important for exchanging thoughts or making plans or reviewing progress or setting agenda. But more often than not, meetings steer in the opposite direction. They fail to achieve the goal they set out to. They're tiresome, stretched out without reason, inconsequential, unproductive. Yes, useless meetings don't just rob companies of money, they also take away your productivity and joy. A study calls them one of the top 5 causes of inefficiency. Another study says that bad meetings reduce communication and collaboration. People's happiness at work takes a hit. But you don't need a study to know all of this. Useless meetings are a shared human experience, and it seems like everyone hates them. How many times have you thought to yourself that this meeting could have been an email? Well, you're not alone. And I believe the kids are calling it meetingitis. It's when unnecessary meetings are held excessively, and lately they've become more common than ever. Meetings have increased in frequency over the past 50 years. Executives spend about 23 hours a week in them. That's up from less than 10 hours in the 1960s. The pandemic only made it worse because in-person interaction was limited. A Microsoft report agrees to this. Since the start of the pandemic, the number of meetings increased by 153% globally. Companies see this. For decades, they've tried to make meetings relevant. Like in 2006, Ford Motor slashed unduly long meetings. In recent years, other companies have tried to get more creative. Some have introduced a no-meeting day every week. Microsoft has a no-meeting Friday. 73% of their employees say it is good for them. 77% say it helps them focus. Canva, the software company, introduced a similar rule, a no-meeting Wednesday. And experts say this helps too. It improves communication, engagement, and satisfaction because all meetings are not problematic. Sometimes Meetings can elevate voices. They can give someone a seat at the table. It's the so-called bad meetings that cause the problem. When they don't have a real purpose, when they run too long, or when they have too many attendees. Studies say workers usually don't need to be in 1/3 of the meetings they attend. So why are they there? For many, entire careers are made up of planning, holding and attending such meetings. Yet no one dares to question them, perhaps because it's a workplace norm. Some are afraid of offending a senior. Some suffer from FOMO, that's the fear of missing out. But this culture needs to shift. What is the point of unnecessary meetings? Only to scratch some kind of managerial itch or to seek respite from desk-bound loneliness? Maybe it's time to end this meeting madness. Financial boom or not, one group always thrives: business leaders. It's a big contradiction of the corporate world. Job cuts for ordinary workers, million-dollar bonuses for CEOs and directors. Try making sense of that. If there is a financial downturn, shouldn't everyone be affected? Well, technically, yes, but in practice, that's not what happens. And why am I talking about this today? Because for some bigwigs, the game is up. Directors at Tesla have settled a lawsuit with their shareholders. Guess how much they're paying? $735 million. The directors will return this money to the company, $735 million. The question is why? Because they overpaid themselves. From 2017, these people awarded themselves around $11 million in stock options. The shareholders caught on to it. They filed a case saying the compensation was too high, and now Tesla has settled. The company won't say why, but court documents say the directors are acting in good faith. Sure they are. What's $700 million over good faith? Elon Musk himself is fighting a similar case. He awarded himself $56 billion in stock options, $56 billion, and that too is being challenged by shareholders. But our story tonight is not just about Tesla. It's about every company out there. Why are CEOs and directors paid these ridiculous sums of money? And why in the middle of job cuts? First, let's look at some numbers. CEOs of American companies are paid around $27 million. That's salary plus stock awards. And this is 399 times more than what average workers earn. 399 times. This gap was not always so high. In 1965, CEOs earned 20 times more. In 1989, 59 times. So what changed after that? Well, in the West, it was a time of economic churn, the 1980s. Governments in the US and the UK cracked down on labor unions. They put more emphasis on the free market, so naturally the gap widened. Another reason was the fall of businesses owned by families or individuals. In their place, shareholders appeared. Now, shareholders are more demanding. They want to see instant results. They want to see profits. So what did board members do? They agreed to pay CEOs more. The assumption was this would drive the company forward, which brings us to present day. High-paid CEOs are a reality of today. Supporters say, let the market decide salaries. If businesses are willing to pay millions, surely they must be worth it. But critics say otherwise. They claim not every CEO is an industry titan. Some of them are piggybacking on other factors like a great tech team or a booming industry or maybe a tax cut. Either way, the payment is ridiculously high and it doesn't change even during bad times. Let's look at some of the big companies now. Meta laid off 10,000 people this year, plus 11,000 late last year. But the same company gave six-figure bonuses to senior executives, not salary, bonuses. Netflix laid off around 4% of their workforce last year. Their CEO has a bonus worth $14 million. Same with Google. They laid off around 12,000 of their employees. That's around 6% of their workforce. But guess how much CEO Sundar Pichai took home? $226 million last year. How do companies justify this contradiction? The argument is the CEOs are highly skilled, that their intellect is key to the company's growth. But if you're firing thousands of people, clearly the company is not growing, yet no accountability. Just think back to the 2008 financial crisis. American banks were headed by the best of the best. And what did they achieve? They plunged the entire world into recession. Tens of thousands of people lost their jobs, but again, no accountability. In fact, they were rewarded. The US government had to spend billions of dollars to bail out American banks. And guess what these banks did with that money? They paid bonuses. 5,000 of the top bankers got $5 billion in bonuses. Tells you where the problem is. There is no scrutiny or independent oversight. Most CEO packages are decided by compensation committees. And who is part of these groups? Board members and executives from other companies. It's like asking actors to rate their own movies. Obviously, it will be 5 stars. So what we need is more transparency, more logic to these numbers. I'm not saying CEOs should earn the same as other workers. They do bring in valuable expertise. They should be paid more than average workers. But how much more is the question? Surely 400 times is too much. Now it's time for Vantage shots, images that tell the story. China has been hit by Typhoon Taliban. Heavy rain created a waterfall on a busy road. Meanwhile, wildfires are burning in parts of California and the United States. We'll show you a time-lapse video of its progression. And Indian cricketer Mahendra Singh Dhoni is famous for his decision-making prowess on the field. But you know, he's also a huge bike and car enthusiast. Former Indian cricketer Venkatesh Prasad shared a video of Dhoni's impressive automobile collection. And finally, we're taking you back in history on this day. In 1947, the Indian Independence Act was cleared by the British monarchy. This act divided the subcontinent. It created 2 new independent nations, India and Pakistan. It also declared India as a sovereign and independent state. We're leaving you with that. Thanks for watching. We'll see you tomorrow.
Any comments on this?
Unless and until someone is mad about this, you can't.
I'll take a video.
Isn't it? Huh? She was not making it for me. Doesn't it look weird? All this, पता नहीं ये बाइक शोरूम हो सकता है ये. इसीलिए जब ये बन रहा था ना तो हम लोग बहुत बड़ा था.
Yeah, it's full. It's full.
ये बन रहा था हमारा.